School, I had a couple of close buddies, Jason and Brian. We accomplished a lot together, but right before Jason's graduation, his father got a job in Lexington, South Carolina, and the whole family had to move away. My friend Brian and I were invited to spend the weekend at his new house after we graduated, and he had finished moving in with his family. As an antidote to our ennui, we set out on foot to explore the woods and farmland around us when we came across a beautiful river. It was a lovely place, very serene, but we got lost in it. We couldn't remember if we were going upstream or downstream, so we just kept going with the flow of the river. We were worried about locating a phone to call Jason's parents to come collect us, even though there was no paved road or street in sight, because there were no signs of civilization any place we could hear. We followed the river until we came upon an old edifice resembling a church, constructed of extremely weathered red bricks and featuring a gravel driveway and parking area. It was severely encroached with vegetation and bushes. We went inside to see if anyone was around so that we could possibly use their phone to find out the address. We saw 4 rusty, filthy and tireless automobiles from what appeared to be the 1970s or 1980s, possibly Novas, parked in the dirt lot. All of them were either currently or formerly white in color, and they were lined up side by side. As we drew nearer, we could make out the sounds of gospel music and singing coming from inside the church. We entered the church, which seemed pretty old and run down, but were relieved to find that there were people inside. We peered through the big doors into the hall and saw around 24 people, dressed as nicely as they could afford to, despite their obvious poverty. The old white lady in horn-rimmed glasses, who was playing the piano in the church, stopped playing as soon as we walked in, and she stared at us blankly. What followed is something I will never forget, no matter how long I live. Everyone in the church put down their song sheets, stopped singing, and slowly turned their heads to gaze at us, with the most expressionless, unwelcoming expressions on their faces. "Sorry to interrupt," Jason said. "My family and I need to borrow your phone so we may call to have someone come and collect us." No one made a comment. The only sound that could be heard across the entire church was the creaking of the wooden pews under the weight of the worshippers. So we just slowly backed out of the door and let it close behind us and looked at each other, an ominous fear, and silently left. Before we knew it, a dozen or so of those people, all men, had walked out into the front of the church and were standing there, watching us intently as we walked up the dirt road. Brian had mentioned that there were no crosses or anything Christian inside. Because of this, we took off running up that dirt road for what seemed like 30 minutes. We pulled into what appeared to be a defunct full-service gas station from the 1970s. We went inside to find that the shelves were mostly empty and filthy from a first scan, and an old, extremely tan, swarthy man with a really oily and dirty baseball cap was behind the counter, reading some ancient book with tattered edges and yellowed pages. After a moment, he spoke up. "You boys lost, huh? When leaving, turn left and continue down that road until you reach a telephone pole. At the pole, turn right. The path leads to the freeway." We thanked him and departed swiftly. On our way to the telephone pole he had mentioned, we glanced back and saw the old man standing with his arms folded, in front of the gas station, staring at us with a rotten-toothed grin. After reaching the marker, we turned right and took the ensuing path to the main road. After a half-hour of trekking in the dusk, we finally made it to the highway, where we unsuccessfully tried to flag down passing motorists. Thankfully, a passing police officer observed our predicament and stopped to assist us. When we informed the police we didn't know where we were and gave the officer Jason's address, he whistled and added, "We really were lost." We were back at Jason's after about 30 minutes, with the cop chatting with us and warning us to be careful in the woods because of the insane witch people that live there. 8 years ago, my friends James and Sean and I did something incredibly idiotic. At the time, though, doing incredibly stupid things was how we passed the time. James and I are no longer close friends, but Sean and I keep in touch often and occasionally reminisce about our time together with James. We were all 19 years old and living in New Jersey, where there were several empty homes and a deserted chapel perched atop a hill not far from our homes. Locals knew about the church. It was on a closed-off road and it had been abandoned for many years. I'm not sure if it's still standing or what the current situation of it is, as I reside in Florida now. As the mischievous thrill-seekers that we were, James, Sean and I had the brilliant concept of sneaking a Ouija board into the chapel after hours. Since it was October, I assume we were celebrating Halloween. The Ouija board was stashed in Sean's closet, so he took it along. I was the driver, and I picked up James and Sean before heading off in the same direction as the church. Our only option was to park on the side of the road and make the short trek on foot to the church, as the road leading up the hill had been completely closed. We used one flashlight at first, so as not to draw unnecessary attention, as we followed the road up the hill to the church. But after we reached the peak of the hill, we all three pulled out our lights. The church had a gravel parking lot and was bordered by trees on all sides. The church's main entrance was already cracked, since it had been broken into so often that the walls were covered with graffiti. It scraped on the floor, so it took two of us to pull it open. However, once inside, we only used our flashlights to glance about to make sure no one else was present. Being there after dark was unsettling, to say the least. Sean put up the Ouija board and with a chuckle grabbed these 3 candles out of his backpack, saying they would enhance the experience. We turned off our flashlights after he set up the 3 candles in a triangle around the board. Since the candles were now the only source of illumination, the atmosphere was somewhat unsettling. Since we couldn't see more than about 6 feet in any direction, we broke out the Ouija board. At this time, Sean did most of the talking. I don't recall his precise words, but he began with the standard tired Ouija board opener of, "Is anybody there?" We laughed as the planchette began to move. One of them had to have done it. I don't think you can use a Ouija board with your pals without jokingly shifting the planchette around the board. We went along with it though, and whoever was moving it typed out a few words. But as everything was happening, we heard a strange cracking sound coming from the church altar. The closest comparison I can make is to the sound of a large piece of wood splitting in two. It was audible, and it seemed to have been made by an individual. Our immediate response was to point the flashlights on our phones in the direction of the altar. As far as we could tell, nobody was around. After that, I'm quite sure they were both as frightened as I was, but since the building was old and falling apart, we figured a few eerie noises here and there weren't too out of the ordinary. There was a lot of back and forth questioning of the board, but eventually the planchette stopped moving. Because that cracking sound had scared the 3 of us, we were paying closer attention. This carried on for a while until something from the altar area once again disturbed the hush. Something fell on the Ouija board, making us all jump and scream before we could shine the lights over there again. The size of the rock was comparable to that of a golf ball. 2 seconds earlier, all 3 of us were holding the planchette. None of us could have possibly pulled off such a feat. We left the Ouija board and candles behind as the 3 of us bolted from the church in a panic. Fearing that we were being pursued, we ran all the way down the hill and back to my car. I drove us all back to James's place, and we remained in the car for a good half an hour, discussing and trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Sean is deeply spiritual and superstitious. He was certain that we had communicated with a spirit. I don't really believe in any of that stuff. There was probably someone else in the church with us, and that's just as unsettling to me. When Sean and James returned to the chapel the next day to retrieve Sean's Ouija board, the board was gone, but the candles were still burning. They left immediately after seeing it was missing from the front door. As far as I can recall, this was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. Warren County, Georgia is located in the central region of the state and is largely rural. I was with my girlfriend Marissa, and we were driving around looking out the neighborhood, seeing if it was somewhere we'd like to reside. We found it to be quite peaceful and roomy. We're both Roman Catholic. She likes to attend to church a little more than I do, though. It was the middle of the day on a weekday, and there was hardly any traffic. Before making a final decision on where to settle, we visited many of the area's most noteworthy attractions. Since Marissa has been an equestrian for the better part of her life, having a barn for her horses was a major motivating factor in our decision to relocate to a more rural region. We were driving along a quiet road, having just finished looking at several for-sale properties when we spotted a quaint little church with a full parking lot. We had just finished touring some nearby homes when we came across this chapel. Marissa tapped me on the shoulder and suggested we check out the service to see if it was nice. So I parked next to an old red minivan in the building's tiny dirt-like parking lot. The majority of the vehicles in the lot were quite vintage, a large number of them in fact. I remarked on this to Marissa as we stepped out of the car, and she concurred, noting that it was likely due to the fact that we were in a low-income neighborhood. I unlocked the church entrance and we walked inside. As anticipated, the interior was somewhat cramped. There were probably 5 rows of pews, each of which was divided down the middle by the nave. At the very least, there were 20 people there, and they definitely weren't all seniors. Usually, at every mass, big or small, you'd see a reasonable proportion of elders. Everyone looked to be in their 30s and 40s based on the backs of their heads, though. It seemed everyone was sitting in silence for some kind of prayer. As we took our seats in the rear, the individuals immediately surrounding us began to examine us critically, and as people around us began to take notice of the gazing, they too turned their attention in our direction. Marissa and I exchanged uneasy glances, then turned back to the group. All we could do was smile, but no one returned the gesture. All of these individuals were giving us the cold shoulder, and I just now realized that nobody was dressed appropriately for a mass. Where did this go wrong? When I looked around, I saw that there were no other women here besides Marissa. It looked like they were staring at Marissa more than me. A masked man at the front of the church near the altar pointed at us and demanded to know, "Who invited you here?" I answered for the group and explained that we were just traveling by and noticed a mass in progress, so we decided to join in. The man was certainly not a priest, and this was clearly not a Roman Catholic church. The man with the mask remarked, "It's time for you to go." By now, every last person in the cathedral was gazing at us. "Come on, honey," I urged, and we jumped to our feet and dashed to the waiting automobile. We didn't linger in the car for long. I quickly got us out of the parking lot, but as we were leaving, we saw someone leaving the building and getting into a van. Once we spotted the grey van closing in on us in the rearview mirror, I knew there was no way they could have followed us. I programmed the Warren County Sheriff's Office into Marissa's GPS, and we headed there immediately. The van followed close behind us the whole time, never directly behind us, but still noticeable. The van failed to stop when we arrived at the public safety parking lot and instead continued on its way. As soon as everything was over, we left Warren County and never looked back. Obviously, we had stumbled upon a cult meeting, but I still don't understand why they followed us, why they met during the day, or why they didn't even bother to close the door.